girl finds an abandoned baby in a cardboard box in the trash and, instead of asking for help, decides to hide it at home. When the mother discovers it, a sad story comes to light. The kitchen trash bag felt unusually heavy as Sophie Mitchell dragged it across the linoleum floor, leaving a thin trail of coffee grounds that had escaped through a small tear in the plastic. She knew she should probably double bag it, but that would mean going back inside, and she had already put on her winter boots. Besides, her mother would be waking up soon for her night shift at the hospital, and Sophie wanted to finish her chores before then. October in Boston had turned bitter early this year. The late afternoon sky hung low and gray, threatening the season's first snow. Sophie pulled her red knit hat lower over her ears as she stepped out the back door of their narrow townhouse, the rusty hinges protesting with a screech that echoed off the brick walls of the alley. Her boots crunched against the thin layer of frost coating the ground, each step sending tiny echoes bouncing between the buildings. Their trash bins sat at the end of the alley, past Mrs. Henderson's overgrown rose bushes and Mr. Patterson's perpetually leaking air conditioning unit. Sophie had made this trip hundreds of times before, but something felt different today. The shadows seemed longer, the air charged with an electricity she couldn't explain. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, "Always be aware of your surroundings, Sophie. The world isn't always a safe place." But she pushed the thought aside. She was halfway down the alley when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. A whimper, like a kitten's mewl, coming from behind the dented recycling bin. Sophie set down her trash bag and took a tentative step toward the sound, her heart beating in rhythm with the soft patter of beginning snowfall. "Here, kitty," she whispered, though something in her chest told her this wasn't a cat. The sound came again, stronger this time, unmistakably human. Behind the recycling bin sat a large cardboard box, the kind her mother's Amazon packages came in, but this one was worn and soggy from the previous night's rain. The flaps were folded shut, but not completely closed. Sophie's hands trembled as she reached for them, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her mother's warnings about stranger danger and suspicious situations flashed through her mind, but something stronger, something that felt like destiny, pulled her forward. The baby inside was tiny, smaller than any baby she had ever seen, wrapped in what looked like a pale pink pillowcase. Its face was scrunched and red, little fists balled up against its chest. As Sophie stared, paralyzed, the baby's eyes opened dark blue, almost purple, and locked onto hers. "Oh," Sophie breathed, and the sound seemed to startle the infant, who began to cry in earnest now, a thin wail that cut through the cold air like a knife. The cry sent Sophie tumbling back into a memory. Tommy at 3 in the morning, his small body burning with fever, reaching for her from his hospital bed. So, he'd called her, his special nickname for her, even when the pain medications made him confused about everything else. Sophie glanced frantically up and down the alley. She should run inside and get her mother. She should call 911. She should do any number of things that responsible people do in emergencies. But all she could think about was how cold it was, and how the baby's cry sounded exactly like Tommy's had 2 years ago, in those final days at the hospital when nothing she did could make things better. Without letting herself think about it too much, Sophie shrugged off her puffy winter coat and reached into the box. The baby was surprisingly light, its head fitting perfectly in the crook of her elbow, just like the dolls she used to practice with when Tommy was first born. She wrapped her coat around the infant, tucking the edges in carefully, the way she'd learned from watching the nurses with her brother. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, gently brushing her thumb across the baby's cheek. "I've got you. I won't let anything bad happen to you." The baby's crying softened at her touch, turning into tiny hiccups that made Sophie's heart ache with remembered tenderness. Inside their house, she could hear the shower running upstairs, her mother getting ready for work. Sophie had maybe 20 minutes before Ellen came downstairs for her pre-shift coffee. 20 minutes to make a decision that would change everything. The warmth of the house enveloped them as Sophie slipped inside, the contrast with the bitter cold making her realize just how dangerous it had been for the baby to be outside. She looked down at the infant, now quieter in the warmth of her coat. Its eyes were closed again, dark lashes fanned against flushed cheeks. Something fierce and protective bloomed in Sophie's chest. Something she hadn't felt since those nights of watching over Tommy, promising him the sun would rise and things would be better tomorrow. Sophie knew what the right thing to do was, but sometimes she thought the right thing wasn't the thing that needed to be done. Not when you'd already lost someone you were supposed to protect. Carefully, moving slower than she ever had in her life, Sophie carried the baby toward her bedroom. Her room was on the first floor, thank goodness, and her closet was big enough. She had all her old baby doll things stored in there: bottles, blankets, even some diapers she had bought with her allowance money last year when she was going through what her mother called her maternal phase. The back door creaked again as she entered, and Sophie froze. But the shower was still running upstairs, and her mother's bedroom door was closed. She made it to her room and closed the door with her hip, then stood in the middle of her butterfly wallpapered bedroom, holding a baby that wasn't hers, trying to convince herself she wasn't making a horrible mistake. "I'll figure something out," she promised the sleeping infant, her voice catching as she remembered making similar promises to Tommy. I need some time to think. I'll do better this time." The shower turned off upstairs and Sophie jumped. Quickly, she cleared a space in her closet, creating a nest of soft sweaters and her spare comforter. She placed the baby down as gently as she could, surrounding it with pillows to keep it from rolling. "Sweet dreams, little one," she whispered, brushing her fingers across the baby's forehead in a gesture that felt achingly familiar. "Sophie," her mother called from upstairs. "Did you take the trash out?" "Yes, Mom." She closed the closet door most of the way, leaving just a crack for air. "Just finished." "Thank you, honey. I'll be down in a minute to make coffee before work." Sophie sat on her bed, heart racing, staring at the closet door. The baby made a small snuffling sound but didn't cry. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the alley where an empty cardboard box sat collecting white flakes. The soft shush of falling snow against her window seemed to whisper secrets, promises, warnings. In her mind, Sophie could hear Tommy's voice, the way he used to say her name when he needed something in the middle of the night. She hadn't been able to help him then, but maybe, just maybe, she could help this baby now. She pulled out her phone and opened a new Google search, "How to take care of a newborn baby." The results loaded as her mother's footsteps creaked on the stairs, each step bringing them closer to a moment that would change their lives forever. A floorboard groaned directly above her room, making Sophie's fingers freeze on her phone screen. The weight of her secret pressed against her chest, heavy as the snow-laden clouds outside. Sophie took a deep breath and began to read. At 3 a.m, Sophie sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, staring at the tiny bundle wrapped in her old gymnastics team sweatshirt. The baby. She'd started thinking of her as Lucy, after reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe last year, and thinking how both she and Lucy Pevensey had found something magical in a closet, was finally sleeping after what felt like hours of fussy crying. "Please stay quiet," Sophie whispered, her eyes burning with exhaustion. Through her bedroom wall, she could hear the TV playing in Mrs. Henderson's apartment next door. The old woman's insomnia had never been more welcome. It had helped mask Lucy's crying, which Google had told her was normal for newborns but felt deafening in the midnight quiet of their house. The words on her phone screen blurred and doubled. "Newborns need to eat every 2 to 3 hours, even through the night." She blinked hard, trying to focus. Earlier, she'd caught herself putting a clean diaper on backwards, and it had taken 3 tries to measure the formula powder correctly. Her mother's voice echoed in her head from one of their post-Tommy talks. "Being responsible means knowing when you need help, Sophie. We can't always do everything alone." But asking for help meant admitting what she'd done, and Sophie couldn't bear the disappointment she knew would flood her mother's face. Not after Tommy. Not after all the promises they'd made to be honest with each other, to face things together, to do better. The empty formula bottle beside her seemed to mock these thoughts. She'd purchased it in a panic from the corner store after school, along with diapers and wipes that had nearly emptied her allowance savings. Mr. Patel hadn't even blinked when she'd bought it, just asked how her mother was doing. "She's fine," Sophie had lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. She's just busy with work. The lies had snowballed from there. No, she wasn't hungry at dinner. She'd spent her lunch money on baby supplies. Yes, she was just tired from studying, not from being up all night with a crying infant. Of course, she was keeping her door closed. She was working on a surprise art project, not hiding a baby in her closet. Each lie felt like a stone in her stomach, weighing her down. But every time she looked at Lucy's face, so trusting and vulnerable, she remembered finding Tommy in his room that last night, when his fever had spiked so high he didn't recognize her. She remembered how helpless she'd felt then, watching the paramedics take him away. She wouldn't be helpless this time. Lucy's sudden cry pierced through Sophie's exhaustion-fogged brain. The sound seemed to bounce off the walls, impossibly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Sophie stumbled to her feet, her legs tingling from sitting too long, and nearly tripped over her school bag. "Please, please, please," she begged, lifting Lucy with trembling arms. The room swayed slightly, and Sophie had to lean against the wall to steady herself. She'd read somewhere that people could hallucinate from lack of sleep. Was that happening now? The butterfly wallpaper seemed to be moving, the patterns shifting and swirling. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks as Lucy continued to wail. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." For a moment, just a moment, she understood why someone might leave a baby in an alley. Then she hated herself for even thinking it. Through sheer force of will, Sophie began the familiar dance of bouncing and swaying that had worked before. "Remember what Mom always says," she murmured to herself. "One problem at a time. Just solve one problem at a time." It had been their mantra during Tommy's illness, when the future had seemed too overwhelming to contemplate. Gradually, Lucy's cries softened to hiccups. Sophie checked her phone again. 3:17 a.m. Her mother would be home from her shift in less than an hour. Before Tommy got sick, Sophie used to wait up for Ellen to come home, loving how her mother would sweep in smelling of hand sanitizer and coffee, always with a smile and a story about helping someone. Now, Ellen came home quiet and drawn, carrying the weight of other people's pain along with her own. She leaned back against her bed, letting her head rest on the mattress. The ceiling fan spun lazily above her, creating shadows that danced across the walls. In the quiet, she could almost pretend this was 2 years ago, when she used to sneak into Tommy's room to check on him during his good nights, before the hospital became their second home. A car door slammed somewhere outside, and Lucy stirred. Sophie quickly reached for her, hands gentle but sure as she lifted the baby to her chest. "Shoo," she soothed, patting Lucy's back the way she'd seen her mother do with the neighbor's kids. "It's okay. Everything's okay." But it wasn't okay, and Sophie knew it. The websites had been clear. Newborns needed doctors, needed tests and shots and proper care. Lucy needed more than a scared 11-year-old could provide, no matter how many articles she read or how carefully she followed the instructions. The sound of a key in the front door lock made Sophie freeze mid-step. Her mother was home early. Sophie's heart began to pound so hard she was sure Lucy would wake up. With trembling hands, she placed the baby in her closet nest, arranging the blankets around her. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to. "Please stay quiet." She had just closed the closet door when she heard her mother's footsteps in the hallway, heavier than usual, weighted with something more than physical exhaustion. They paused outside her room and Sophie dove for her bed, pulling the covers up to her chin just as the door creaked open. Ellen Mitchell's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the hallway night light. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and her hands, always so steady, even during Tommy's worst days, were fidgeting with her ID badge. "Sophie," she said softly, "are you awake?" Sophie considered pretending to be asleep, but she knew her breathing would give her away. "Yeah," she whispered back. "How was work?" Ellen stepped into the room, and Sophie could smell the hospital on her. Antiseptic and coffee and something else. Something that reminded Sophie of the day they'd learned Tommy's treatment wasn't working. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, her movements careful, contained, as if she was holding something fragile inside herself. "We need to talk, sweetheart," Ellen said, running a hand through her graying hair. Something happened at work tonight. A young mother. She left her baby at the hospital. Just walked away. Her voice caught slightly. It reminded me of how many people are carrying pain we can't see. How sometimes good people make desperate choices. Sophie sat up slowly, her heart in her throat. In the closet, Lucy made a tiny sound, so soft it could have been the house settling. But Ellen's head turned toward the sound, her nurse's instincts as sharp as ever. Her whole body tensed, like a string pulled taut. "Sophie," she said, her voice different now. "What was that?" The world seemed to slow down as Ellen took another step into the room. Sophie opened her mouth, but no words came out. In the closet, Lucy began to cry. The sound filled the room like smoke, impossible to ignore or explain away. Sophie watched as her mother's face changed, confusion giving way to understanding, then to something complex and painful. Her hands, which had been fidgeting, suddenly went still. Ellen crossed the room in 3 quick steps and opened the closet door. The cry grew louder, more insistent. Sophie couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Oh my God," Ellen whispered, staring at the baby in the nest of blankets. Her hands were shaking now as she turned to Sophie, her face a battlefield of emotions. Shock, fear, anger, and underneath it all, a deep, aching sadness that Sophie recognized from the mirrors in their house after Tommy died. "Sophie Mitchell," Ellen said, her voice cracking on the name. "What have you done?" And just like that, Sophie's carefully constructed world of secrets began to crumble around her, like snow melting in the morning sun. But somewhere in the wreckage, in her mother's trembling hands and broken voice, she thought she caught a glimpse of something else, something that looked almost like understanding. Ellen Mitchell stood frozen by the open closet door, her silhouette sharp against the darkness beyond. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound in the room was Lucy's crying, which had settled into a steady, insistent rhythm that seemed to echo off the walls of Sophie's small bedroom. The sound filled every corner of the space, making the room feel both impossibly large and suffocatingly small at the same time. Sophie remained perched on her bed, her fingers clutching her comforter so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She watched her mother's face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across it like shadows from the streetlight outside. Shock, anger, disbelief, and something else, something deeper that Sophie couldn't quite name. The digital clock on Sophie's nightstand clicked over to 4:13 a.m., its red numbers casting a faint crimson glow across the room. The sound of Mrs. Henderson's television next door had finally fallen silent, leaving them in a pocket of quiet broken only by Lucy's cries and the soft whoosh of the heating system cycling on. Finally, Ellen moved. With the practiced efficiency of a veteran nurse, she reached into the makeshift nest of blankets and lifted Lucy. The moment the baby settled into her arms, something flickered across Ellen's face, a ghost of the tenderness Sophie remembered from before Tommy's illness, when her mother's hands had healed scraped knees and checked foreheads for fever with equal measures of love and skill. It was an expression Sophie hadn't seen in so long that it made her throat tight with sudden tears. "Sure, little one," Ellen murmured, her voice professional yet gentle. "Let's have a look at you." Her fingers moved with practiced precision, checking temperature, noting breathing patterns, examining the baby's color and responsiveness with the kind of automatic competence that came from years of working in pediatrics. Lucy's cries softened under her touch, as if recognizing the familiar rhythm of medical care. Sophie watched as her mother's trained eyes scanned the baby, noting every detail of Sophie's amateur caretaking, the homemade diaper change, evident in the slightly crooked tape and uneven folds, the formula stains on the borrowed clothes that Sophie had tried to clean with baby wipes, the careful, if clumsy, way Sophie had tried to keep Lucy's head supported with rolled-up blankets. Each observation seemed to add another layer of tension to Ellen's already rigid posture. But there was something else there too, a slight tremor in her hands that Sophie hadn't seen since Tommy's final days. The tremor took Sophie back to that last week in the hospital, when her mother's hands had shaken as she'd straightened Tommy's blankets, adjusted his 4 lines, checked his vitals with movements that had become more desperate with each passing hour. Sophie had watched then, just as she watched now, feeling that same helpless ache in her chest. "Mom," Sophie began, but Ellen held up one hand, silencing her. The gesture was so familiar, the same one she'd used in Tommy's hospital room when she needed quiet to think, to plan, to make the kind of decisions that no mother should have to make. How long? The question cut through the room like a scalpel, precise and painful. Sophie swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Since yesterday. I found her behind the recycling bins when I took out the trash. The words tumbled out, bringing with them the weight of all her other secrets. The stolen moments of sleep between feedings, the careful rationing of her allowance money for supplies, the constant fear of discovery. She was in a box, Mom. Just left there like she was nothing. Like nobody wanted her. I couldn't. You couldn't what, Sophie? Ellen's voice was dangerously quiet, but her eyes, when they met Sophie's, were swimming with unshed tears. In the dim light, they looked almost colorless, like the way they'd looked the day they'd left the hospital for the last time. Tommy's room empty behind them. You couldn't call 911? You couldn't come get me? You couldn't do any of the things we've talked about, any of the responsible choices. The word responsible hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all their post-Tommy conversations about doing the right thing, about being stronger, about moving forward. Sophie had promised so many things in those grief-filled months. To be more careful, more thoughtful, more mature. Now each promise felt like another stone in her stomach. Lucy's crying had softened to whimpers under Ellen's expert touch. The baby's dark eyes were open now, staring up at Ellen with that same trusting gaze that had captured Sophie's heart in the alley. Ellen looked down at the infant, and something in her face changed. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly as she traced a finger along a small birthmark on Lucy's shoulder, and suddenly all the color drained from her face. "Get your coat," she said, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear. She was already moving toward the door, her nurse's stride purposeful and quick. "We're taking her to the hospital." "No!" Sophie jumped up, panic surging through her exhaustion. Her vision blurred with tears as she imagined Lucy being taken away, disappearing into the system like so many stories she'd read online during her sleepless night of research. Stories of babies lost in bureaucratic mazes, of families separated, of chances at happiness slipping away like water through cupped hands. "Mom, please, you don't understand. I've been taking good care of her. I got formula and diapers and what about medical care?" Ellen turned back, her voice breaking on the last word. The movement caused Lucy to startle, and Ellen automatically began the swaying motion that all mothers seem to know instinctively, even as her words came sharp and fast. "What about jaundice screening? Metabolic testing? What about the vitamin K shot that prevents brain bleeding? The 100 other things a newborn needs that you can't provide, Sophie, because you are a child." The word child hit Sophie like a physical blow, making her stumble back until her legs hit the edge of her bed. I wasn't trying to." She stopped, fighting back tears as the full weight of her actions crashed over her. Then, in a voice so small it was barely audible, she whispered the truth that had been driving her since she'd first heard that cry in the alley. She cried just like Tommy did. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lucy seemed to sense the shift in the room's atmosphere, her whimpers fading to silence. Ellen stood very still, the baby in her arms, her face caught in a shaft of pre-dawn light that had begun to seep through the window. The light painted strange shadows across her features, making her look simultaneously younger and older than her years. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, as if the mention of Tommy had punctured something in her professional armor. "What do you mean?" Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm air flowing from the heating vent. The cold seemed to come from inside, from the place where she kept all her memories of Tommy, all the things she hadn't been able to say since he'd gone. "That night when I found her, she made this sound, this little cry, and it was exactly like Tommy used to sound when he needed me. Remember how he would call for me even when the pain was really bad? How he trusted me to help him? He would reach out his hand, and I would hold it, and for a little while he wouldn't be scared anymore." Sophie's voice caught on a sob. "He trusted me to help him, Mom, and I couldn't do anything except watch him hurt, watch him slip away." But with Lucy, I could actually do something. I could keep her warm and fed and safe. I know it wasn't right, hiding her like this, but I needed to not be helpless again. Just for a little while. Ellen took one step toward her, then another, each movement careful as if she were walking on ice. In the growing light, Sophie could see tears tracking down her mother's cheeks, catching the dim light like tiny stars. Lucy had drifted off to sleep in Ellen's arms. One tiny hand curled around Ellen's finger in a gesture so trusting it made Sophie's heart ache. For a moment, mother and daughter sat in silence, watching the baby breathe. The quiet was broken by a distant siren somewhere in the city, its wail rising and falling like a cry of its own. Ellen flinched at the sound, her nurse's instincts obviously pulling her toward thoughts of emergencies and responsibilities. But instead of moving toward the door, she sank down onto the bed beside Sophie, still holding Lucy close. "Listen to me very carefully," Ellen said finally, her voice thick with emotion. She shifted Lucy slightly, adjusting her position with the kind of unconscious expertise that Sophie had tried so hard to imitate. "What happened to Tommy was not your fault. You were not helpless. You were there for him every single day, in ways that broke my heart and made me prouder than I've ever been." She paused, swallowing hard, and Sophie realized with a start that this was the first time they'd really talked about Tommy's last days since the funeral.